Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today we're embarking on a journey, really digging into a massive historical shift, the slow unraveling of one of the most enduring empires the world has ever known. I mean, picture this. It's the mid-16th century. The Ottoman Empire is this colossal force straddling three continents, a name that genuinely inspired awe and, frankly, fear across Europe.
Absolutely. Especially after they captured Constantinople, a city that had, resisted conquerors for centuries. And under Suleiman the Magnificent, they reached this incredible peak.
Right, the absolute zenith. We're talking about a state at the height of its power, advanced military, just dominant force.
And it's so important to start with that image, that grandeur, because it makes what happened next so striking, almost unbelievable. Because after Suleiman composed Golden Age, it wasn't a sudden implosion. It was this slow and arduous decline, as our sources put it, stretched over nearly 400 years. Think about that, 4 centuries.
4 centuries of gradual decline. It's staggering. And you see these early warning signs, don't you? Like Lepanto in 1571, that big naval defeat.
Exactly. And then maybe even more significantly, that failed siege of Vienna in 1683. That really felt like a turning point in terms of their expansion, maybe even how they saw themselves.
So given this huge historical arc, our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack the really complex, the multifaceted reasons behind this decline. We're not just listing dates. We're going to dissect the internal political decay, the economic problems creeping in, the social unrest bubbling up.
And of course, those relentless external pressures, all leading to the final dissolution in the early 20th century. And we need to look at the reform attempts too, right? Those desperate efforts to save the empire.
Trying to breathe life back into this fading giant, often against, well, what must have felt like impossible odds.
And it's fascinating how an empire that was so powerful, so feared for so long, eventually gets that rather dismissive label, the sick man of Europe. How did that happen? Despite centuries of trying to adapt, trying to reform, it just couldn't withstand the pressures, culminating, of course, in World War I.
So the big questions are, how did this slow unraveling actually happen? And, what can we learn from it? Are there echoes today? That's what we want to explore.
Let's dive right into those cracks, starting right at the supposed height in that golden age.
Okay, let's begin right at the heart, the Sultanate itself, just after Suleiman. It's debated, of course, but our sources really suggest the decline, or at least the seeds of it, started with the sultans themselves becoming less engaged.
Less active.
Suleiman, for all his achievements, apparently grew weary of the constant campaigning, the sheer grind of administration.
It's understandable, ruling such a vast territory.
Right. So the sources say he withdrew more and more, seeking leisure. And that set a really dangerous precedent.
And the immediate consequence of that withdrawal is absolutely critical. Because someone had to fill that gap, right?
Exactly.
So the office of the Grand Vizier became incredibly powerful, second only to the Sultan himself in authority, in revenue, even have the right to demand absolute obedience from everyone.
Which on the surface sounds like a workable solution, doesn't it? Keep the administration running.
It does. But there's a fundamental flaw. A really deep one.
And this is where it gets interesting, digging into the Ottoman system. Our sources point to this profound separation. The Grand Vizier could do the day-to-day governing, sure, but they couldn't command that same focus of loyalty, as the source puts it, not across all the diverse groups in the empire.
Right. The Sultan wasn't just a ruler. He was this symbol, this spiritual head, the embodiment of the empire itself. That personal loyalty, almost mystical, couldn't just be transferred to an official.
So separating that loyalty from the actual central authority, that weakened the government's ability to really impose its will, didn't it? Created a disconnect.
Absolutely. A profound detachment. Imagine this sprawling empire held together by the perceived authority of this increasingly distant figure. A Grand Vizier, however capable, just couldn't fill that symbolic role.
Which naturally weakened central control.
And opened the door for other power centers to emerge, didn't it? Fragmenting the empire from within.
And that fragmentation links directly to another key internal dynamic, the rise, or really the triumph, of the Divschirm.
Ah, yes, the Divschirm. We should probably clarify that for listeners.
Good point. So we're talking mid-16th century. There's this major power struggle between the Divschirm. These were Christian youths recruited into the Ottoman system, converted, trained, theoretically loyal only to the Sultan.
Right, often rising from nothing to positions of immense power, like the Janissaries in the military or high up in the administration. a counterbalance originally to the old Turkish nobility,
Exactly. And this struggle, our sources say, ended with a decisive win for the Divjur.
which had huge consequences. The Turkish nobility, who'd held sway in the capital for so long, basically lost their power there.
Pushed out. So they retreated to their old bases, southeastern Europe, Anatolia, creating this new kind of internal divide.
And the economic and military impact. Pretty immediate and pretty bad for the state.
Definitely. The Devshirme, now dominant in the capital, started grabbing up the Taimars. These were crucial land grants, right? Traditionally given to the Turkish nobility to support the Sipahi cavalry.
The backbone of the early Ottoman army, providing soldiers and revenue.
Exactly. But instead of maintaining them for state service, the Devshirme essentially treated them like private property, private estates.
So the state loses out twice. No military service from the Sipahis supported by those lands, and no tax revenue either. A double whammy.
Which raises that question about the military itself changing, doesn't it? The Sipahis faded in importance.
Relatively speaking, yeah. And the Janissaries, that elite infantry, mostly from the Devshirme, and the artillery, became the dominant force. A shift to infantry and gunpowder.
But crucially, these Janissaries, this new dominant force, they were becoming increasingly self-interested, weren't they? Less focused on the empire, more on their own perks and power.
Precisely. Which leads right into that corrosive element. The rampant corruption and nepotism.
With the Turkish nobles out of the picture in the capital, the Devshirme had almost unchecked control, even over the sultans.
And the sources are really clear. They started using the government machine for their own benefit, their own enrichment. It wasn't about the sultan or the empire anymore.
And it wasn't just isolated cases, was it? It became systemic, endemic at basically every level.
It really did. The whole system seemed geared towards it. And what's more, with their main rivals gone, the Devshirme class itself just fractured. Countless factions, parties, all vying for advantage.
How did they do that?
Typically by backing a specific imperial prince, trying to get their candidate on the throne, someone they could control.
Ah, so that's where the infamous harem politics comes in. These Devshirme factions aligning with palace factions, often led by the royal women, mothers, sisters, wives.
Exactly. So after Suleiman getting on the throne or getting a top job, it wasn't really about ability or merit anymore. It was all about intrigue, backroom deals, who had the most influence in these competing factions.
That sounds disastrous for leadership quality.
It was. Because these new power brokers, they found it much easier to control princes if they were kept
Well,
ignorant and inexperienced.
so that old tradition, princes getting real-world experience governing provinces, that disappeared.
Pretty much replaced by isolation in the harem apartments. Their education was limited, certainly not preparing them for ruling a complex empire.
So you end up with sultans who just lack the ability to wield real power, even if they wanted to.
Right. You see examples like Selim II, the Sot, they called him, or Murad III. They had tried playing factions off against each other to gain some leverage, but that just weakened the Grand Vizier's office even more.
The very office that was supposed to be running things.
Exactly. And after the powerful Grand Vizier Mehmed Sokollu fell in 1579, power just shifted around. First, you had the so-called Sultanate of the Women for a while.
Around 1570 to 1578.
Roughly, yeah. And then the chief janissary officers, the Agas, they dominated from about 1578 to 1625.
But whoever was nominally in charge, the result was the same.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Growing administrative paralysis across the board, which led straight to more anarchy, misrule, and society fracturing into these hostile little groups. The whole central authority was just crumbling from the inside.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to the economy. Because under those chaotic political conditions, how could a government possibly tackle the growing economic problems of the 16th and 17th centuries?
It couldn't, really. And they faced some major shocks. Like in the late 16th century, you had the Dutch and the British opening up new sea routes, bypassing the traditional Middle Eastern land routes.
Cutting out the Ottoman middlemen.
Exactly. And that had a huge ripple effect. Those Middle Eastern provinces that relied on that overland trade, their prosperity plummeted.
And it wasn't just trade routes, was it? There was inflation, too.
Massive inflation, largely driven by all that silver and gold flooding into Europe from the Americas, which then spilled over into the Ottoman world, devaluing their own currency.
Creating a trade imbalance, more European goods coming in.
Yeah, paid for with this cheaper silver. And at the same time, the Ottoman treasury is losing revenue because of all the corruption and the powerful factions draining it. So they got desperate.
What did they do?
Resorting to drastic measures, debasing the coinage. basically reducing the silver content, sharply hiking taxes on people already struggling, even outright confiscations of property.
Did it work?
No, the sources say it just made things worse, created this vicious cycle of poverty, resentment, and more economic instability.
So how did this affect ordinary people and even state officials?
Well, if you were on a salary like in the administration or the army, you're chronically underpaid. Your wages just weren't keeping up with inflation.
Which leads to...
More corruption, more theft. Officials overtaxing the population to make up their own shortfall. It just fed on itself this systemic problem, like a cancer in the administration.
And what about the land? That backbone of the early empire.
Rampant abuse there, too. People holding timars or tax farms, they stopped thinking long-term. Became about short-term extraction. Squeeze everything you can out right now.
Not about maintaining the land for the future or for the state?
Not at all. And worse, through political influence and corruption, many managed to turn these state lands into private property. Malkin, life holdings, or vakif, religious endowments, effectively cutting off future obligations and revenue to the state.
A massive privatization bleeding the state dry.
Pretty much. The state was losing control and money from its most valuable asset. And if you connect that to social unrest, well, things got worse.
How so?
You had significant population growth in the 16th and 17th centuries, much like Europe. But unlike parts of Europe, Ottoman food production didn't keep up. In fact, because of the anarchy and exploitation, it actually fell.
More people, less food. A recipe for disaster.
Exactly. Widespread social distress, disorder, peasants losing their land to high taxes or corrupt officials. They started fleeing.
Which just made the food shortages worse for everyone else.
Right. Many flooded into the cities, causing urban problems, food shortages, crime. But many others stayed in the countryside.
And formed rebel bands.
Yes, out of sheer desperation. Groups like the Levins and the Jalolis, they became a major source of instability, these Jaloli revolts. Raiding, disrupting trade, taking what they could.
And the government couldn't stop them.
It got weaker and weaker. These gangs took control of large areas, kept the tax money, even cut off food supplies to cities and the frontier armies. It was like a slow-motion internal collapse.
What did this do to the military, the janissaries, and others?
It disintegrated from within. Salaried positions often became just sources of income. People paid for military service they never actually performed. Ghost soldiers on the payroll.
So who was actually fighting?
Increasingly, it relied on contingents from vassals like the Crimean Tatars, plus whatever rabble, as the sources say, they could scrape together for campaigns. Lacking discipline, lacking loyalty.
But somehow the empire didn't just collapse then and there.
That's the surprising part. The army, even in this weakened state, was still usually strong enough to put down the worst of the provincial revolts. It could still project some force.
But it was a constant struggle.
A constant drain. These revolts popping up everywhere made effective government outside the main cities almost impossible, prevented any real recovery.
So how did it hold on for so long? What kept it going through all this decay?
That's a great question. Our sources point to this underlying societal structure, a kind of cushion.
A cushion?
The Nilets, those autonomous religious communities, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish, each with their own leaders and laws, plus the various guilds, economic, social, religious, and the ulama, the religious scholars and legal experts, who still held immense influence.
So these local structures provided stability.
They helped buffer people, and even the ruling class, from the worst effects of the central government's decay. Provided local order, continuity. It arguably allowed the empire to survive much, much longer than it otherwise might have.
That's fascinating, a kind of hidden strength.
Exactly. And this resilience meant that for a long time, especially in the 17th century, outsiders didn't fully grasp how weak the empire had become internally.
So Europe still feared the Ottoman army?
For the most part, yes.
Yeah.
Much as they had centuries earlier. They were unaware of how hollowed out it was. And, the army could still win battles, prevent total collapse, even make a few more conquests. It gave a false impression of strength.
Right. So even with all that internal rot, there was still some reserve power, or at least the perception of it. Like after Lepanto in 1571, that huge naval loss.
They bounced back surprisingly quickly, rebuilt the navy, regained control in the eastern Mediterranean for much of the next century. They took back Tunis in 74, Fez in 78, even Crete from Venice in 1669 after a really long war.
Those are significant wins, despite everything. Shows the system wasn't completely broken yet.
Definitely. And Europe's lingering fear acted like a shield. No one dared to seriously challenge the peace treaties from Suleiman's time. which, ironically, protected the Ottomans from the full consequences of their own weakness for quite a while.
And they even launched new campaigns sometimes.
Yeah, like when Moscow started pushing near the Black Sea, Murad III took advantage of chaos in Iran to grab the Northern Caucasus and Azerbaijan in the late 16th century.
Bringing the empire to its absolute peak territorially.
Its greatest extent. And those new provinces brought in much-needed revenue, a temporary financial boost that helped mask the deeper issues for maybe half a century, gave them breathing room.
Which brings us to those early reform attempts in the 17th century. Were they a genuine effort to fix things?
They were definitely a reaction to crises. You see reformers like Sultans Osman II, Murad IV, and especially the Köprülü Grand Viziers, Mehmed Pasha and his son Fazıl Ahmed Pasha. They came to power when things looked really dire.
Driven by defeats and threats.
Exactly. Existential threats. Like the war with the Habsburgs, starting in 1593, where the Austrians pushed deep into Ottoman territory. Only a lucky win in 96 saved them.
And the Treaty of Zitsitorak in 1606 that followed that actually revealed their weakness.
Ironically, yes. It showed Europe they weren't invincible anymore, which encouraged their enemies. And in the East, Shah Abbas revived Iran, took Iraq in 1624, threatened the whole eastern flank.
Murad IV eventually got Iraq back, right?
He did in 1638. But Iran remained a costly threat. And then there was that draining war with Venice over Crete from 1645 to 1669. It stretched resources thin, even exposed Istanbul to attack. These constant pressures forced the ruling class to accept some reforms out of sheer necessity.
But here's the key question. Why didn't these reforms stick? Why weren't they enough?
Because fundamentally they were too limited. Our sources are clear. They were essentially conservative efforts, trying to restore the old successful system.
Like trying to rewind the clock, reinstating timars, limiting taxes, crushing revolts, fixing the currency, executing corrupt officials, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Patching up the symptoms, not curing the disease. They were often successful in the short term, preventing immediate collapse. But they failed permanently because they didn't address the root cause.
Which was?
The self-interest and entrenched power of the ruling class itself. As soon as the crisis passed, those groups just went back to their old ways, benefiting from the decay.
And there was another problem, wasn't there? A blind spot.
A fatal one.
Yeah.
The Ottoman reformers just didn't grasp how fundamentally different, how much more powerful the Europe they face now was. Europe had transformed since the Reformation, industrially, scientifically, militarily.
They were fighting a 17th century war with a 16th century toolkit and mindset?
Exactly. So even when their reforms worked temporarily, they couldn't close that widening power gap. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the changing world.
But this traditionalist approach, ironically, it did create a kind of revival, didn't it? Leading to that final disastrous push.
It did. A final surge of ambition. By 1681, the army seemed strong enough for Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha to try taking Vienna again, July to September 1683. But it massively overstretched them.
And provoked a huge reaction. That failed siege of Vienna was the big turning point, wasn't it? Shifting the balance of power for good?
Absolutely. The defenders, led by the Polish king Jan Sobieski, held out, and it galvanized this major European coalition determined to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, now that its weakness was clear.
So the Habsburgs wanted Hungary and the Balkans back.
Venice wanted its naval bases and trade power.
And Russia, eyeing the straits.
Always. Access to the Mediterranean was the goal. Under Peter the Great and later Catherine, that became a driving ambition.
But it wasn't simple, was it? Other European powers had different ideas.
Not at all. A complex web. France and Sweden actually tried to prop up the Ottomans sometimes, fearing Habsburg or Russian dominance would upset the balance of power.
And neutral powers like Britain and the Netherlands?
They wanted to keep their trade privileges. Those capitulations from 1536 were incredibly valuable, giving them tax breaks and legal advantages. And they also didn't want any one power controlling the whole region.
So while Austria and Russia were fighting the Ottomans militarily, they were also stirring up trouble internally among Balkan Christians.
Actively fomenting revolt, which forced the Ottomans into this difficult position. Try to appease their non-Muslim subjects or crack down, all while trying to play the Habsburgs and Russians off against each other. A desperate balancing act.
In this period, from Vienna in 1683 to, say, the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, it was just war after war, wasn't it? Chipping away at the empire.
Relentlessly. The Holy League War ending at Karlowitz in 1699, a huge blow. Then wars with Russia, Venice, Austria. Treaties like Pruth, Passarwitz, Belgrade, Kusuk, Kainarka, Jassy. Each one usually meant more losses.
What was the territorial impact? Hungary gone?
Hungary, Banat, Transylvania, Bukovina. The border basically pushed back to the Danube where it had been centuries earlier.
And the Black Sea coast?
By 1812, pretty much all gone. Bessarabia, southern Ukraine, and crucially, Crimea. Losing the Crimean Tatars was a big military loss, too. They'd provided strong cavalry.
But maybe the worst part wasn't just land, it was that legal intervention clause.
That was ominous, yes. Russia and Austria gaining the legal right to intervene on behalf of the Sultan's Christian subjects. That dramatically increased European influence inside the empire, setting a precedent for future meddling, eroding sovereignty.
Okay, let's talk about the internal resistance to change in the 18th century. Why was it so hard to adapt, even with all these defeats?
Well, for one, many in the ruling class simply didn't want change. They benefited from the chaos, the weak central control gave them local power and wealth.
Complacency and self-interest.
And also, incredible isolation. They genuinely believed their own ways were superior. Remedies for decline had to come from within their own traditions, their own experience, an inward-looking mindset.
Still believing in their own superiority, even after all the losses.
It seems so. That belief might have been justified back in Suleiman's time, but by the 18th century, it was a dangerous blind spot. They were largely unaware of the huge leaps Europe had made, industrial, scientific, technological, political, military.
So they didn't see the defeats as proof of Western superiority.
No, they saw them as proof that the Ottomans weren't properly applying the old, successful techniques, a kind of nostalgia blocking recognition of the new reality.
Which meant 18th century reforms were basically just repeats of the 17th century wars, limited, focused on restoration.
Largely, yes. Only piecemeal adoption of specific European weapons or tactics. Like bringing a slightly sharper sword to a gunfight, convinced the problem was just technique.
Were there any contacts with the West? Did any new ideas filter in?
Some. A few ambassadors went to Europe, more European merchants and consuls came in. Even a handful of Ottoman scholars corresponded with Western thinkers. But the impact was very limited.
Why? Different ways of thinking.
Fundamentally different cultural priorities, different intellectual frameworks. Those Ottomans who were enthusiastic about European ideas. Our sources call them voices in the wilderness. They had little effect.
So it led to mostly superficial changes, like the Tulip period.
Exactly, the Tulip period, roughly 1718 to 1730. Under Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, some elites adopted European dress, palaces imitated Versailles, growing tulips became this huge fad. It was about fashion and lifestyle, not deep structural change.
What about the printing press? That seems significant. Ibrahim Mutefarika setting up a Turkish press in 1727.
It was significant, yes, but faced huge resistance from the scribes who saw their jobs threatened. It operated intermittently, but it did publish books on history and geography that slowly, gradually began to open a few minds among the literate elite. A slow burn.
And military reforms remained stuck, still trying to create new corps alongside the resistant Janissaries.
Pretty much. The established corps, especially the Janissaries, refused to change. They saw new ways as a direct threat to their privileges. So reformers had to create entirely new, separate units to use new weapons and tactics with European instructors.
But these new units didn't last.
Often not. They were like temporary mercenary groups, tied to a specific patron. When the patron fell from power, the unit often dissolved, made consistent reform impossible in the army.
Except the Navy. That was different.
That's the fascinating exception. Real, lasting naval reform happened under Grand Admiral Ghazi Hassan Pasha between 1770 and 1789, with Sultan Abdulhamid's backing.
Why did it work there?
Because the Ottoman Navy had been utterly crushed by the Russians at the Battle of Hizme in 1770. Total devastation. There was basically no old guard left to resist change. It was a blank slate, forced by catastrophe. A unique situation.
And that naval success sort of sets the scene for the 19th century, doesn't it? A period of much more desperate, radical attempts at modernization, starting with Selim III.
Exactly. Selim III, often seen as the real pioneer of modern reform. Even as a prince, he was planning army modernization. But he inherited that costly war with Austria and Russia, so serious reforms had to wait for peace.
And when he did start, the Janissaries resisted.
Fiercely, so violently that Selim shifted focus. Instead of reforming the old corps, he created an entirely new European-style army. The Nizam acceded the new order.
Trained by Europeans, modern weapons, but quite small.
Never more than about 10,000 active soldiers. A bold step, but limited in scale. And to avoid provoking the old guard too much, it had its own separate funding source.
The Iradga seeded the new revenue from new taxes and confiscated Taimars.
Right. Salim also set up factories for weapons, technical schools for officers, a more systematic approach.
But the old military core remained hostile.
Deeply hostile, saw the Nizam as seated as a threat, which limited its size and how much it could actually be used. And Salim faced other problems too, these powerful local notables, the Ayans, rising up in the provinces, challenging central control.
And constant external pressure derailing things, like Napoleon in Egypt.
Exactly. 1798 to 1801 forced Salim into an awkward alliance with Britain and Russia. Plus, rising nationalism. The Serbian Revolution starting in 1804, another war with Russia from 1806.
Just constant crises, making it impossible to focus on reform or defy the Janissaries, who were still the main fighting force.
Pretty much.
Uh-huh.
And Salim himself, the sources suggest, was maybe a bit weak personally. He tended to back down when opposition got strong.
Which led to his overthrow in 1807 by a conservative coalition.
Yes, Janissaries, religious scholars, they deposed him. A conservative backlash under Mustafa IV, reforms ended, reformers massacred. An attempt by Bayraktar Mustafa Pasha, one of the powerful Ayans, to restore Salim, actually led to Salim's death, a tragic end.
But his efforts weren't totally wasted. They paved the way.
Absolutely. The schools he founded, the increased contact with the West during the revolutionary era, it significantly increased Ottoman knowledge, broke that isolation, planted seeds for the more radical changes to come.
Which brings us to Mahmud II, a ruler who seems to have learned from Salim's failures.
Definitely. The conservatives didn't last long after Salim's death. In 1808, surviving reformers found allies among those powerful Balkan Ayans who were getting worried about the anarchy themselves.
Led by Bayraktar Mustafa Pasha again.
Yes, he helped overthrow Mustafa IV and install Mahmud II, intending to resume reforms.
But the Ayans protected their own power first, with that covenant of union.
They did, briefly. But another Janissary uprising killed Bayraktar, and the conservatives took charge again. By the end of 1808, the empire looked like it was falling apart.
How bad was it? Central control gone.
Minimal. North Africa independent, Muhammad Ali building power in Egypt, Mamluks in Iraq paying lip service, Wahhabis defying them in Arabia, only 2 provinces in Anatolia firmly controlled, powerful local lords everywhere else in Europe, Serbia in revolt.
And externally, still threatened by Russia and Britain.
Initially, yes. Looked like the end game.
So what saved Mahmud? What gave him a chance?
Ironically, Napoleon. The major European powers were so preoccupied with him, it gave the Ottomans a crucial, temporary breathing space. Britain made peace in 1809. Russia gave back the Romanian principalities in 1812, though kept Bessarabia.
A critical lull, allowing Mahmud to focus internally.
Yeah, exactly. And he used it decisively. His main goal, rebuild the army into a loyal force to preserve the empire, which meant confronting the Janissaries head-on.
So in 1826, he proposes a new European-style army, the Janissaries Mutiny.
As expected, June 15th. But this time, Mahmud was ready. The auspicious incident. His loyal forces were prepared, and they massacred the mutinous Janissaries, ended their centuries of power in one bloody day.
How did he succeed where Salim failed? Better tactics.
Much better. He'd secured support from the top religious scholars, the ulama. The Janissaries had lost public support by then. He had loyal officers within the Janissary Corps and loyal troops ready. And crucially, brilliant PR, he framed it not as Western imitation, but as restoring the glorious military of the Ottoman Golden Age.
Very clever. And the old system was finished off soon after. The Timar system abolished in 1831.
Completely abolished. Remaining timers taken back by the government. The end of the old feudal-style military. The new army, European-trained Moltke, was an advisor, was fundamentally more loyal to the Sultan.
Making it the key tool for centralization and driving other reforms.
Absolutely. The constant need to pay, equip, and train this new army forced changes everywhere. Higher education for officers and doctors, tax system overhaul to get the money, administrative reorganization to manage it all. Military reform was the engine.
So the old system of minimal government, local control, was replaced by state centralization.
Progressively, yes. Mahmud curbed rivals, weakened the ulama's power, even set up a directorate to control their independent finances from religious endowments. Cuff. Built roads, started a postal service in 1834, laying infrastructure for control.
And the central government itself reorganized.
Massively. European-style ministries created, taking power from just the Grand Vizier. New planning councils, like the Supreme Council of Judicial Ordinances in 1838 as a legislature. More security for bureaucrats. No more property confiscation. A translation bureau. Embassies reopened. fostering contact with Western ideas.
And this new army and administration allowed him to regain control over those semi-independent local powers.
Exactly. After 1812, he systematically extended central authority over Anatolia, Iraq, Rumelia, suppressing the Serbian revolt temporarily, bringing regions back under direct rule, really rebuilding the empire's core.
But even with all this, major challenges remained, like Muhammad Ali in Egypt.
A huge challenge. His own modernization was perhaps even more effective. His invasion of Syria in 1831 routed the Ottomans, threatened Istanbul itself. Mahmud had to ask Russia for help. The Treaty of Huncara-Skelezi in 1833, which really worried Britain and France.
Syria was recovered eventually.
With European help, yes, in 1840. But Muhammad Ali got hereditary rule of Egypt in 1841, a major loss of direct control.
And Greece. Independence.
The Greek Revolt, starting 1821, fueled by nationalism and opposition to centralization. It ended after European powers destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian fleet at Navarino in 1827. Greece became autonomous in 1829, fully independent in 1832. Another painful loss.
And Serbia, too. More autonomy.
Yes. Russian pressure led to war in 1828-29. The Treaty of Edirne gave Russia territory and forced Ottoman recognition of Serbian autonomy, along with more privileges for Moldavia and Wallachia. The slow erosion in the Balkans continued.
So when Mahmud died in 1839, the empire was smaller, but stronger internally, more centralized.
Definitely diminished, yes, but much more consolidated, centrally powerful than it had been for ages, yet increasingly caught in European power plays. But the process of modernization, the respectability of change, as symbolized by adopting the fez in 1829, had truly begun.
Which leads us straight into the Tanzimat Reforms, this major period from 1839 to 1876 under Mahmud's sons.
Abdulmasih and Abdulaziz. Yes, the Tanzimat, marked by those famous imperial edicts, the Hada Sharif of Guhan in 1839 and the Hatu Humayun in 1856. But there's always been debate about what really motivated these reforms.
Right. The Western view often sees them as cynical ploys, doesn't it? Just trying to win European support during crises.
Pointing to things like Christian equality promises not being fully implemented, or the timing 1839 when facing Muhammad Ali, 1856 after the Crimean War, 1876 with rising European pressure.
Like the poll tax on non-Muslims being replaced by an exemption tax that was often higher, or Christians still largely kept out of the army.
Exactly, those points are raised. However, our sources suggest this might miss the Ottoman perspective. While Europe focused on Christian rights, for the Ottomans, the absolute main goal of the Tanzimat was preserving the state, survival.
So modernization wasn't just about appeasing Europe. It was primarily about strengthening the empire itself against collapse and aggression.
That seems to be the core driver. Concessions were made, yes, and some reformers likely did believe in equality eventually. But the need to mobilize resources to save the state was paramount.
So the key reforms focused on strengthening the state's capacity: military, administration, education, law.
Absolutely. The army saw major reorganizations in 42 and 69, borrowing from the Prussian conscript model. Administration was streamlined, centralized further, and huge changes in education and law, recognizing a modern state needs modern institutions and citizens.
Let's look at education. Before Tanzimat, it was controlled by the millets, right? Religious focus.
Overwhelmingly. The first state inroads were those specialized military and medical schools Mahmud started, grafting on Western training for specific needs.
But the Tanzimat aimed for a whole state system, from primary to university?
That was the plan, first laid out in 1846, then a more ambitious plan in 1869 for free, compulsory primary education. Progress was slow, lack of money, resistance, but it laid the foundation for a secular state education system, chipping away at millet control.
And by 1914, there were thousands of schools, though maybe still mostly small, traditional ones.
Over 36,000, yes. But the state system was often outpaced by the non-Muslim millet schools, which were often more modern, and especially by the foreign missionary schools, American, French, British. Places like Robert College, the Syrian Protestant College, they played a huge role educating tens of thousands.
In legal reform, what were the goals there?
Two main goals. First, make Ottoman law acceptable to Europeans so they could get rid of the capitulations, those extraterritorial rights for foreigners, and regain full legal sovereignty. Second, modernize Islamic law for a modern state.
Which led to new legal codes based on French models.
Heavily influenced by France, yes. Commercial code, penal code, maritime law, eventually the Missel civil code. And increasingly, these laws were applied in new state courts, outside the traditional religious courts controlled by the ulama.
Did it work? Did they get rid of the capitulations?
Not immediately, no. European resistance was too strong. But it laid the groundwork for a modern, more secular legal system, a crucial step toward sovereignty.
But these Tanzimat reforms faced massive obstacles, didn't they? Lack of money, skilled people.
Constantly hampered by those, and fierce opposition from traditionalists, especially the ulama, who feared the empire's Islamic character was being destroyed. They often managed to slow things down or water down reforms.
And European powers interfered too, hindering centralization.
Actively obstructing Ottoman attempts to regain control in places like Bosnia, Montenegro, Lebanon, Crete. Even after helping them in the Crimean War, the peace settlement basically created Romania, another loss. Europe often used the empire's weakness for its own ends.
Now, here's a crucial twist. The success of Tanzimat centralization, ironically, led to the next crisis by removing checks on the Sultan.
It seems so. After the influential reformer Ali Pasha died in 1871, Sultan Abdulaziz abused his now unchecked power, excessive spending, erratic decisions, and directly contributed to that huge crisis from 1875 to 1878.
A perfect storm. Drought, floods, famine, heavy taxes, conscription burdens.
All hitting at once. Plus, the massive public debt, $200 million by 1875. Annual payments were over half the national revenue, and they couldn't even meet half of that due to a global financial crash. Bankruptcy loomed.
Igniting the Balkan uprisings. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Bulgaria.
Exactly. Fueled by nationalism, peasant discontent, Ottoman suppression attempts led to war with Serbia and Montenegro and massive European pressure for reforms.
Which the Ottomans rejected, leading to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78.
Yes. Russia declared war, aiming to crush them. The Ottomans put up a surprisingly fierce fight at Plevna, which actually bought time for Britain and others to intervene diplomatically, worried about Russia getting too strong.
So the initial Treaty of San Stefano imposed by Russia was really harsh.
Incredibly harsh. Huge independent Bulgaria, independence for Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, land losses, huge indemnity.
But the Congress of Berlin in 1878 scaled that back, thanks to British pressure.
Significantly. Bulgaria was shrunk and divided. Serbia, Montenegro, Romania got independence, but smaller gains. Russia kept Kars and Batum. Crucially, Austria-Hungary got control of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Britain took Cyprus.
A massive defeat still. Ottoman Europe reduced to Macedonia, Albania, Thrace.
Pretty much just that sliver left. And European influence was stronger than ever. Britain even wanted to supervise reforms in Asia, though Sultan Abdulhamid II managed to block that.
And the finances. That led to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA.
Yes, the Decree of Muharrem in 1881 reduced the debt, but assigned key revenues directly to this European-controlled body to ensure payment, a glaring symbol of lost sovereignty.
Did the OPDA basically run the Ottoman economy?
Not quite. It was hugely influential, collected revenues, facilitated foreign investment, but it remained under Ottoman political control, and ironically, its existence gave lenders confidence, allowing the Ottomans to borrow even more. But combined with banks and the capitulations, it definitely restricted their financial freedom.
Okay, this crisis sets the stage for the 1876 Constitution and then Abdulhamid II's long autocratic reign. What were the internal reactions to the Tanzimat by this point?
Three main lines of criticism from Muslims. Simple, traditionalist opposition, wanting no change. Then a more sophisticated critique from intellectuals, the young Ottomans who wanted reform but felt Tanzimat was flawed. And third, a push from within the bureaucracy itself to control or even depose the Sultan.
Tell us more about the young Ottomans, exiles in Europe.
Many were, yeah. A loose group, influenced by European liberalism, but with varied views. Some secular, some deeply Islamic. Namik Kemal is often seen as representative. He admired the West but criticized blindly copying it. He argued for constitutional government based on Islamic principles.
Synthesizing tradition and modernity, arguing for a representative assembly based on Islamic practice.
Exactly. He helped popularize the idea of a constitution and this new concept of an Ottoman fatherland, loyalty to the state itself. And the growing Ottoman press in the 1860s helped spread these ideas.
But the most immediate impact came from the bureaucrats wanting to control the Sultan, led by Midhat Pasha.
Yes, driven by being shut out of power and Abdulaziz's disastrous policies. This led directly to Abdulaziz's deposition in May 1876, after those student riots, a clear sign of deep unrest.
But his successor, Murad V, went mad.
Quickly became mentally unstable, yes. Deposed after 3 months, replaced by Abdulhamid II. This chaos convinced Midhat that a constitution was essential, a permanent check. Abdulhamid agreed to it to secure the throne.
So the 1876 constitution, first in the Ottoman Empire, what was it like?
Derived from the Sultan's will, He kept full executive power. Ministers reported only to him. A two-chamber parliament elected lower, nominated upper. Defined rights, but essentially, as sources say, an attenuated autocracy. Power is still concentrated.
And Midhai accepted that controversial Article 113, giving the Sultan power to deport anyone.
He did, which drew criticism, though arguably the Sultan had enough power elsewhere in the constitution anyway. But it didn't matter much in practice. The parliament met in March 1877, was dissolved less than a year later due to the war with Russia, and wasn't recalled until 1908. Midhat and other liberals were exiled or killed. End of Experiment 1.
So began Abdulhamid II's reign, 1876 to 1909, often seen as reactionary, but you're saying he actually fulfilled Tanzimat's goal of centralization.
In a way, yes. He used the tools that Tanzimat had built: the army, administration, communications like telegraph and railways, plus a vast spy network to utterly monopolize power and crush all opposition. Centralization taken to its extreme, autocratic conclusion.
Earning him that grim title, Red Sultan, for the Armenian massacres.
Yes, the brutal repression in 1894-96 showed the dark side of that control. But to be balanced, his reign also saw progress. Education advanced, Istanbul University was renovated, legal reform continued, economic development too, like railways built with foreign capital, and notably the Hejaz Railway.
Ah, the Hejaz Railway to Medina, funded by Muslims worldwide, part of his pan-Islamism.
A key part. Pan-Islamism as a political tool really emerged earlier, with the claim to be caliph, spiritual leader of Muslims everywhere, even those outside Ottoman borders, a claim boosted by the legend of the caliphate transfer in 1517.
A useful myth.
Very useful diplomatically for Abdulhamid. With European powers controlling vast Muslim populations, he could use the threat of stirring up trouble via the caliphate to deter them from pushing him too hard. Internally, he used popular Islam, Sufi orders, the press, to rally Muslim loyalty behind him.
And did he succeed in preserving the empire territorially during his reign?
Relatively speaking, yes. After the big losses of 1878, things stabilized somewhat. No major losses until 1908, except maybe Tunisia and Egypt, where control was already gone. He suppressed revolts in Crete, even defeated Greece in 1897, though had to grant Crete autonomy. Blocked European reforms in Macedonia, expanded a bit in Arabia. He held the line mostly.
Okay, which brings us to the final act. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908. Where did this come from? Opposition building against Abdulhamid.
It had been brewing for decades. Conspiracies starting back in 1889, often originating in military medical colleges. This led to the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, or Young Turks.
Many went into exile, right? Developing critiques of the Hamidian system.
Yes, figures like Ahmed Raza, Prince Abahedin, debating the way forward, centralization versus decentralization, reliance on Europe, continuing the intellectual ferment from the young Ottoman era.
But the actual revolution started in the army, in Macedonia.
Crucially, yes. Discontent within the Third Army Corps. Officers frustrated with pay, conditions, the regime's perceived weakness. They acted largely independently of the CUP leadership in Paris. Whether it was one big conspiracy or just coalescing discontent is debated.
And the spark was Major Niazi in July 1908, demanding the constitution back.
Exactly. He decamped with followers. The rebellion spread. Abdulhamid couldn't rely on his troops to suppress it. On July 24th, he was forced to restore the 1876 constitution.
What did these officers initially want? Just the constitution?
Primarily, yes. Their main goal was preserving the empire, which they felt Abdulhamid was endangering. They hadn't thought much beyond restoring constitutional rule, initially leaving government to the bureaucrats.
But then came the counter-revolution, the 31st March incident in 1909.
Right. A mutiny in Istanbul by ordinary soldiers, unhappy with conditions, suspicious of reforms, encouraged by religious conservatives. It showed the CUP's initial weakness, but also gave them their chance.
How so?
The government couldn't handle the mutiny, so the Action Army from Macedonia, led by Mahmud Şevket Pasha, marched on Istanbul, suppressed the mutiny brutally.
And that was the end for Abdulhamid.
It sealed his fate. He was deposed, replaced by his brother Mehmed V, who was largely a figurehead. The constitution was amended, shifting real power to parliament, but with the army, especially Şevket Pasha, pulling the strings behind the scenes.
So the CUP came to power, but their hold was shaky initially.
Very shaky. They gained prominence, yes, but relied heavily on the military. They won a big election majority in April 1912, but lost support fast after the disastrous war with Italy over Libya. Army hostility forced them out in July 1912.
Replaced by the Liberal Union. But they didn't last either.
No, they presided over the catastrophic defeats in the First Balkan War, which gave a small group of determined CUP officers the chance for another coup. the Sublime Porte incident in January 1913, violently forcing the liberals out,
So the CUP was back in control.
more or less. Şevket Pasha led the cabinet initially, but after he was assassinated in June 1913, the CUP established a truly unionist-dominated government, a firm, almost dictatorial grip that lasted through World War I.
Their foreign policy was disastrous, but were there positive internal developments under the Young Turks?
There were, often overlooked. They pushed centralization further, reformed provincial administration. Crucially, they were the first Ottoman reformers to actively promote industrialization, passing laws in 1909 and 1915, laid groundwork for future state planning.
And education, law, social change.
More attention to primary education, further secularization of law, growth in national journalism, public debate, even improvements in the status of women, some access to higher education, public roles, a really intense period of social and political discussion.
And Turkish nationalism started to emerge more strongly, alongside Ottomanism and Islam.
Definitely. Especially after the Balkan Wars stripped away so many non-Turkish populations.
Yeah.
Cultural groups like the Turkish Society and Turkish Hearth promoted Turkish language and identity. Political movements like Pan-Turkism also gained traction, though maybe limited influence on the CUP leadership itself.
Where did Pan-Turkism come from? Aiming for unity of all Turkish peoples.
Largely from Turks in the Russian Empire, Crimea, the Volga region. Figures like Ismail Gasprinsky advocating a common Turkish language. Many migrated to Ottoman lands, bringing these ideas. Yusuf Aksuraoğlu argued Turkism was a better basis for the empire than weak Ottomanism or broad Pan-Islamism.
And Pan-Turanianism, that was even broader.
Much broader, yeah. Exploring linguistic links to Mongols, Finns, Hungarians, some envisioned this vast political federation. Pretty ambitious, probably unrealistic.
But the government itself stuck to Ottomanism officially. Were the accusations of forced Turkification accurate?
Our sources suggest it's oversimplified. The government remained officially Ottomanist. Extending state activities naturally spread the Turkish language, which caused some reaction. But Muslim solidarity generally held. Separatism was much stronger among Balkan Christians.
Okay, but the foreign policy, that led straight to disaster. The 1908 revolution created opportunities for others.
Immediately, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bulgaria declared full independence. Italy grabbed Tripoli, Libya, and the Dodecanese Islands. Concerned by treaty in 1912, constant losses.
And then the Balkan Wars, 1912-13, catastrophic.
Utterly. First Balkan War, faced a united Balkan League, lost almost everything in Europe, Crete, Macedonia, Albania created, pushed back almost to Istanbul by the Treaty of London.
But they got a bit back in the Second Balkan War, when the Balkan states fought each other.
They cleverly intervened against Bulgaria, Recovered Edirne and eastern Thrace, a small symbolic win, but the overall result was devastating. Lost over 80% of their European territory, 2/3 of the population there, fundamentally changed the empire, now primarily Anatolian and Arab.
Setting the stage for World War I, how did they get dragged into that? Was it inevitable? German influence?
Not inevitable. Our sources call it an overly hasty calculation of likely advantage. German influence was strong, yes, but maybe not decisive. Trade with Britain and France was still larger.
Yeah.
They could have stayed neutral, as many in the cabinet wanted.
So why join the Central Powers?
Opportunism, largely. War Minister Enver Pasha, one of the ruling CUP triumvirs, saw a chance. Early German victories looked impressive. There was friction with the Entente over those German warships they sheltered, and of course long-standing hostility to Russia, who coveted Istanbul. That led to the Black Sea bombardment in October 1914 and the Entente declaring war. A choice, really.
But they fought hard, made a significant contribution.
Absolutely. Tied down huge numbers of Entente troops. Fought on multiple fronts. Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Gallipoli, of course, even Europe. Showed remarkable resilience, even dominating Transcaucasia briefly in 1918.
And during the war, the Young Turks acted decisively on internal matters, abolishing the capitulations.
Yes, unilaterally, September 1914, finally free of those restrictions. Ended Lebanon's autonomy, executed Arab nationalists in Damascus, and tragically, the Armenian genocide.
The systematic massacres and deportations, aimed at eliminating perceived support for Russia on the Eastern Front.
That was the horrific justification given. Between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians killed or deported. A truly dark chapter.
How did the end come? Collapse from within.
Massive desertions after 1916. Crippling economic pressure. The final straw was Bulgaria surrendering in September 1918, cutting their link to Germany. The CUP cabinet resigned, a new government formed, and the Armistice of Mudros was signed October 30, 1918. End of the war for them. End of the empire, really.
And the Allies had already planned the carve-up, secret wartime agreements.
Oh, yes. Sykes-Picot carving up the Middle East between Britain and France. Russia promised Istanbul and the Straits, though they dropped out. Italy promised chunks of Anatolia. Britain making conflicting promises to Arabs and Jews regarding Palestine. A complete mess of agreements dividing the spoils.
Which led to the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, the official peace treaty.
Presented in 1920, yes. Incredibly harsh. Would have left only Istanbul and a bit of Thrace. Lost Arab provinces, large part of Anatolia to Armenia, Izmir potentially to Greece, internationalized straits, strict financial control. Basically reducing Turkey to a rump state.
But crucially, it was never ratified.
Never ratified. And that's where Mustafa Kemal comes in, Ataturk, an Ottoman general who led the nationalist resistance against these terms, asserting Turkish rights over Turkish inhabited lands.
Setting up a rival government in Ankara, abolishing the Sultanate in 1922.
Exactly. Declared the Sultan's government illegitimate, puppets of the Allies, then abolished the Sultanate altogether. End of 600 years of Ottoman rule.
And his military successes forced a renegotiation, leading to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923.
Yes. Lausanne superseded Sèvres. A triumph for Turkish nationalism, won on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. Then, October 1923, the Republic of Turkey proclaimed. And finally, March 1924, the Caliphate itself abolished, the dynasty expelled. The definitive end.
So recapping this immense 4-century story, it wasn't a sudden event, was it? But this long, complex process.
Multi-layered decline, deep internal decay, political, economic, social, compounded by those shifting external pressures, and ultimately an inability to adapt quickly or deeply enough to a rapidly changing world.
The great paradox. Such initial might, such longevity over 600 years, yet it crumbled despite centuries of reform efforts.
Those efforts were often too little, too late, or misdirected, trying to restore a past that couldn't compete. Later reforms were more radical, that faced huge resistance, internal division, and constant external interference.
Which leaves us with that final thought, doesn't it? What lessons are there about the fragility of power, the dangers of internal decay, the absolute necessity of adaptation?
And maybe about resilience, too. How did it last so long, despite the rot? Do elements of this story echo elsewhere, even today?
Definitely gives you a lot to think about. The long, complex fall of a truly monumental empire.
Indeed. A story with echoes that resonate far beyond its own time.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We hope you're leaving with a richer, more nuanced understanding of this incredible historical transformation.